In 1968, an RAF pilot was so furious at his own government gutting the Air Force that he buzzed Parliament at rooftop level and then flew a Hawker Hunter straight through Tower Bridge. They didn't court-martial him. That's the part nobody tells you. They locked him in a psychiatric ward instead, because a court-martial would have given him a microphone, and what he had to say was too dangerous to let the public hear. The RAF quietly exonerated him roughly 14 years later, and the thing he was protesting? It never stopped, not for a single year. His name was Alan Pollock, born 1936, and before anyone writes him off as some hothead who snapped, before the word reckless enters the conversation, you need to understand who this man actually was. Pollock joined the RAF in the mid-1950s and trained as a fighter pilot during the last great era of British aviation supremacy, when Britain still designed and built some of the finest military aircraft on Earth. And the RAF still flew them in numbers that could darken a sky. He served with No. 4 Squadron, then deployed to Aden, the British protectorate in what's now Yemen, where an insurgency was tearing through the Radfan mountains and hunters were flying ground attack missions in support of British troops on the ground. This was not peacetime flying. This was combat. Low-level strafing runs into mountain valleys where ground fire came up at you from ridgelines, and the spares were always short, and the airframes were being pushed harder than peacetime maintenance schedules ever intended. Pollock flew operationally in that theatre, and it taught him something no amount of formation flying over the English countryside ever could. He understood, in his bones, what happened when politicians in London promised defence capability and then didn't provide the aircraft, the spare parts, or the squadron strength to back those promises up. After Aden, he was posted to No. 1 Fighter Squadron. If that name doesn't mean anything to you, it should. No. 1 Squadron was the senior squadron of the entire Royal Air Force, tracing its lineage back to 1912 when it formed as No. 1 Squadron of the Royal Flying Corps. 2 world wars on its roll of honour, aces, legends, a history so deep it practically had its own gravitational field. To be posted there was recognition of the highest order. And Pollock didn't just serve, he rose to flight commander, leading B Flight, responsible for the operational readiness and combat effectiveness of a section of the RAF's most storied unit. His wingman, writing a tribute in Key Aero magazine, remembered him as a consummate professional, an outstanding pilot, and a man of fierce conviction about the RAF's fighting capability. Before Tower Bridge ever entered the picture, Pollock had already built a reputation thrilling airshow crowds with precision aerobatics. Inverted flying along the crowd line, the kind of display only a pilot with total mastery of his machine would even consider attempting. So, that's who we're talking about. Not a maverick, not some frustrated desk jockey playing fighter race for a day. A decorated, operationally proven flight commander of the most prestigious fighter squadron in the Royal Air Force. A man trusted to lead other pilots into combat. A man who'd already served in a war zone and done the job for real. When such a man does something extreme, the question isn't whether he's lost his mind. The question is, what pushed him past the point of endurance? But first, the aircraft. Because you can't tell this story without understanding what he was flying. And you can't understand what he was flying without falling at least a little bit in love with it. The Hawker Hunter. If you've never seen one, look it up right now. Then look again. The Hunter is widely considered the most beautiful combat jet ever designed, and honestly, it's hard to argue. This is an aircraft that looks sculpted rather than engineered. Clean swept wings of perfect proportion, a fuselage tapering to a fine tail, and that distinctive nose intake giving it an almost organic predatory silhouette, like something designed by nature rather than a drawing office in Kingston upon Thames. It was the final masterwork of Sir Sidney Cam, the genius who'd already given the RAF the Hurricane, the Fury, the Tempest, and the original propeller-driven Typhoon. Cam understood something most designers miss entirely, that aerodynamic efficiency and visual beauty are often the same thing. In the Hunter, he proved it beyond any doubt. First flight, 20th of July 1951. Entered RAF service in 1954. Powered by a Rolls-Royce Avon turbojet. And here's where words start to fail, because the Avon's distinctive high-pitched howl was one of those sounds you didn't just hear, you felt it. At full power and low altitude, it produced a shrieking roar that rattled windows and stopped pedestrians dead in the street. Not a rumble, not a drone, a shriek. A banshee wail that announced the aircraft before you ever saw it and lingered in the air after it was gone. Top speed 715 miles per hour, just shy of the sound barrier. Armament: 4 30mm Aden cannons, each capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute. A devastating weight of fire for ground attack or air-to-air combat. Wingspan: 33 feet 8 inches. Length: 45 feet 10 inches. Over 1,900 built in total, serving with air forces across the world. But the numbers don't explain why pilots loved it the way they did, with something that bordered on the romantic. The Hunter was renowned among those who flew it for sublime handling characteristics. Responsive without being twitchy. Forgiving without being sluggish. Pilots said it felt like an extension of the body. Point and it went. Pull and it climbed. Roll and it followed your thoughts before you'd finished thinking them. There are pilots alive today who flew dozens of types across 40-year careers and still name the Hunter as the finest aircraft they ever sat in. Not the fastest, not the most lethal, the finest. The one they'd take up again tomorrow if anyone would let them. And here's what matters for this story. The Hunter was British designed, British built, powered by a British engine, conceived by British engineers, and assembled by British workers in British factories. By 1968, those factories were closing. Those engineers were being scattered to other industries, other countries, anywhere that still wanted what they knew how to do. The political class had decided that Britain could no longer afford to produce such machines. The Hunter wasn't just an aircraft, it was proof of what Britain could build when it chose to, and a standing rebuke to every politician who decided it should stop choosing. Which brings us to what Pollock was actually protesting. Because this wasn't about one policy or one cancellation. It was a decade of destruction, each blow worse than the last, and the accumulated weight of it was crushing. It started in 1957 with the Defence White Paper under Duncan Sandys, which declared manned military aircraft essentially obsolete, and the future of British defence lay in guided missiles. That single document, motivated almost entirely by cost-cutting rather than any honest strategic assessment, devastated RAF morale and triggered a generation of cancellations. But the worst was still coming. Harold Wilson's Labour government arrived in 1964 with Dennis Healey as Secretary of State for Defence, and Healey, brilliant, abrasive and committed to slashing defence expenditure, launched the most savage programme of cuts the RAF had ever endured. In April 1965, the government cancelled the BAC TSR-2. This still bleeds in British aviation circles, and it should. The TSR-2 was a supersonic tactical strike and reconnaissance aircraft that was, by every credible assessment, one of the most advanced military aircraft in the world at the time of its murder. Mach 2 at altitude, transonic speed at treetop level, state-of-the-art avionics that were a generation ahead of anything else flying. The prototype had already taken to the air and shown extraordinary promise. The government killed it on grounds of cost. And then, in a gesture of almost vindictive finality that haunts British aviation to this day, they ordered the completed and near-completed airframes physically destroyed. Not mothballed, not stored, destroyed. Jigs smashed, tooling broken apart and scrapped. Engineers who'd spent years building something magnificent were scattered to the winds. The message was unmistakable. No future government would be allowed to reverse this decision. An American replacement was ordered instead, the F-111K, a variant of the F-111 that hadn't even been built yet, and whose selection infuriated the RAF because it meant total dependency on a foreign aircraft to fill the gap that a British one had been specifically designed to fill. Cancelled alongside the TSR-2, the Hawker P-1154, a supersonic vertical takeoff fighter that would have been a revolutionary leap beyond the Harrier. Gone. Then, in January 1968, barely 3 months before Pollock's flight, the Wilson government cancelled the F-111K order too. Let that sink in. The aircraft that had been used to justify killing the TSR-2 was itself killed. The RAF was left with nothing. No TSR-2, no P-1154, no F-111K. No funded program to replace any of them. The cupboard wasn't just bare. Someone had taken the cupboard as well. Simultaneously, Healey's 1966 Defence White Paper had committed Britain to withdrawing from east of Suez, abandoning the global military posture that had justified and sustained much of the RAF's entire force structure. The supplementary papers issued in 1967 and 1968 cut further and deeper still, disbanding squadrons, closing bases, slashing commitments. The RAF was being hollowed out from every direction at once, and nobody in uniform was allowed to say so publicly. And then came the final, gratuitous insult. On April 1st, 1968, the Royal Air Force turned 50 years old. 50 years. The world's first independent air force, established 1st April 1918, reaching its golden jubilee, and the government refused to authorise a commemorative flypast over London. Nothing. No ceremony worthy of the name. For Pollock and many of his fellow officers, this wasn't an administrative oversight. It was a deliberate humiliation. A signal from a government that was actively ashamed of its own armed forces, or at least unwilling to publicly celebrate an institution it was busy dismantling. 4 days later, Alan Pollock made his decision. On the morning of Friday, the 5th of April 1968, Flight Lieutenant Pollock was leading a formation of Hawker Hunters from No. 1 Squadron out of RAF West Raynham in Norfolk. He'd later describe what followed as a spur-of-the-moment decision, though spur of the moment doesn't mean unmotivated. The fury had been building for months, years. At some point during the flight, Pollock broke formation. He turned his Hunter FGA-9 toward London. He came in along the Thames, low, fast. The Rolls-Royce Avon screaming at a pitch that would have been audible for miles across the flat approach to the city. He headed straight for the Houses of Parliament, and he didn't make one pass, he made 3. 3 separate passes over the Palace of Westminster at rooftop level, each one a deliberate, unmistakable provocation. Each one shaking windows and snapping every head within half a mile skyward. MPS in their offices, civil servants at their desks, tourists on Westminster Bridge clutching their guidebooks. All of them suddenly, violently aware that a military jet was tearing across the seat of government at an altitude so low it seemed like the wingtips might clip the towers of Parliament itself. 3 times. He wanted them to know. He wanted them to feel, just for a moment, the power of the institution they were destroying. And then he turned the Hunter toward Tower Bridge. Tower Bridge. Two Gothic Revival towers, rising 143 feet above the Thames, connected at the top by covered walkways and at road level by the famous Bascule Bridge. The gap between the towers at road level, roughly 200 feet across. Vertical clearance between the road deck and the upper walkways, about 112 feet. The Hunter's wingspan, 33 feet 8 inches. Its height, 13 feet 2 inches. Technically, the margins were there. Technically. But Pollock wasn't flying a mathematical exercise on a sheet of paper. He was threading a jet aircraft through a Victorian bridge over one of the most famous rivers in the world, at a speed that compressed every decision into fractions of a second, with granite towers flashing past on either side, and the roadway rushing beneath in a grey blur, and the walkways closing overhead like the jaws of a trap. One gust of crosswind, one fractional misjudgment of bank angle, one moment of target fixation on the wrong tower. And the aircraft strikes stone at several hundred miles per hour, killing Pollock instantly and very likely killing people on the bridge and in the river below. He made it through. The Hunter punched through the gap between the towers of Tower Bridge and emerged on the other side into the open air of the Pool of London. And Alan Pollock became the first pilot in history to fly a jet aircraft through Tower Bridge. Now, does footage of that moment exist? The audience deserves a straight answer, so here it is. Almost certainly, no. No film, no photograph, no moving image of the actual moment the Hunter passed between the towers has ever surfaced in more than 56 years of searching. The reason is simple and a little heartbreaking. This was 1968. No smartphones, no dash cams, no CCTV covering the river approach. Tower Bridge had no security cameras trained on the sky. The event was completely unexpected. Nobody on the bridge or the banks of the Thames had any reason to be pointing a camera upward at that precise second. By the time anyone below registered what was happening, the Hunter was through the gap and gone. A thunderclap of noise, a flash of swept wing, then nothing but a receding roar, and the question of whether you'd really just seen what you thought you saw. This happened before the age of cameras in every pocket, so what we have are the accounts of those who witnessed it, the official records that confirmed it happened, and Mike Rondo's striking painting that tried to capture what no lens ever did. The absence of footage doesn't diminish the event. If anything, it amplifies it, gives the Tower Bridge fly-through a mythic quality that no shaky phone video could ever match. From the ground, it was pure sensory overload. The noise came first, always the noise. The Aden, at low altitude, produced a sound so overwhelming it wasn't merely heard, but physically felt. A concussion of displaced air rattling the steel walkways of the bridge and echoing off the stone of the Tower of London standing guard nearby. Then the visual. A grey, swept-wing shape materialising between the towers at a speed that made it almost impossible to process. There and gone in a heartbeat. The brain scrambling to reconcile the sight of a military jet occupying a space that belonged to buses and pedestrians and river barges. Pollock himself, in a detailed first-person account he later gave to Key Aero, offered one detail that grounds the entire fly-through in human scale. As the Hunter screened through the bridge at road deck level, he glimpsed a cyclist on the bridge, a lone figure, pedalling across the roadway between the towers at the exact moment several tons of Hawker fighter came hurtling through the same gap at several hundred miles per hour. That cyclist never came forward publicly and will likely never know who they were. There's something both comic and terrifying in that image. The most ordinary act in London, cycling across a bridge on a Friday morning, interrupted by the most extraordinary thing that bridge had ever witnessed. Tower Bridge's own official history describes the moment with the dry understatement of an institution that's seen a great deal in its 100-plus years of existence. On 5th April 1968, an RAF pilot, angered by the decisions of his high command, broke formation and flew over London. That might be the most British sentence ever committed to print. After the bridge, Pollock continued his protest, beating up 4 more airfields across East Anglia before finally bringing the Hunter in to land back at West Raynham. When the Aden wound down from its shriek to silence and the canopy came open and the Norfolk air hit his face, his career in the Royal Air Force was effectively over. But here's where the story gets darker than most people realise. Much darker. The common telling says Pollock was court-martialed. That's what you'd expect. A court-martial is the standard response when a military officer breaks every regulation in the book, endangers civilian lives, and embarrasses the chain of command in front of the entire nation. A court-martial is a formal proceeding. It's public, it's reported in the press, it gives the accused a defence counsel, and, critically, it allows him to speak, to present evidence, to explain his reasoning to a panel of officers, and, through the press coverage, to the country. And that, precisely, was the problem. Alan Pollock was never court-martialed. They didn't give him a trial. They didn't give him a platform. They gave him a psychiatric ward. When he landed at West Raynham, the full weight of the military establishment came down immediately. Close arrest. There was never any doubt he'd broken regulations. Unauthorized low flying over populated areas, breaking formation without permission, endangering life and property, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. The charges practically wrote themselves. But the debate within the RAF and the Ministry of Defence wasn't whether to act against him, it was how. And someone, we may never know exactly who, realised that a public court-martial would be catastrophic for the government. Because a court-martial would have required Flight Lieutenant Alan Pollock, decorated combat veteran, flight commander of No. 1 Squadron, to stand in a courtroom and explain, under oath, in front of journalists, exactly why he did what he did. He would have laid it out, programme by cancelled programme. The TSR-2, destroyed. The P-1154, killed. The F-111K, cancelled 3 months ago. The squadrons disbanded. The bases closed. The golden jubilee of the world's first air force passed over in silence by a government too ashamed or too hostile to acknowledge it. Every fact would have been entered into the record. Every newspaper in the country would have run it. And Pollock, articulate, credible, a man with a genuine combat record and undeniable expertise, would have been virtually impossible to dismiss. So they found another way. Instead of a trial, they declared him mentally unfit. Instead of a courtroom, a psychiatric facility. Instead of letting him make his case to the nation, they silenced him with a diagnosis. He was placed before a medical board and eventually discharged from the RAF on medical grounds. Not convicted of anything, not acquitted of anything, just removed, quietly, without the inconvenience of a public proceeding where he could speak. Stop and think about what that means for a moment. A decorated flight commander, trusted to lead men into combat, operationally proven in a war zone, an exemplary service record by every measure that existed before that Friday morning in April. Declared mentally unfit, not because any genuine psychiatric evaluation found him to be unwell, but because he'd embarrassed a government, and the government needed him silent. It's the kind of thing you associate with the Soviet Union. Dissidents declared insane, locked away where their words couldn't cause trouble. It happened in Britain in 1968, to a man whose only crime was being right too loudly. But the story didn't end there. Roughly 14 years later, around 1982, the RAF moved to officially exonerate Pollock for flying through Tower Bridge. Not with a press conference, not with a formal public apology or a medal ceremony, or anything that might have acknowledged the scale of what had been done to him. In its own quiet, institutional way, the establishment acknowledged that the man they'd silenced had a point. The precise mechanism of this exoneration, whether it was a formal review board, a quiet administrative decision, or a combination of both, has never been fully disclosed. Because of course it hasn't. That would require admitting what the original punishment actually was. But the effect was clear. Pollock was cleared. The stain of the psychiatric discharge was, in effect, withdrawn. 14 years too late to save his career. Too late to give him back the years in uniform. Too late to undo the damage to a man who'd given his professional life to the RAF and been repaid with a locked ward. But not too late to matter. Not to Pollock, and not to history. In interviews throughout his later years, Pollock never wavered. Not once. He stood by what he'd done, not with bitterness, not with self-pity, but with the quiet, immovable certainty of a man who knew he was right and had the patience to wait for history to catch up. He didn't apologize. He didn't equivocate. He simply stated again and again that someone needed to do something, and nobody else was going to. And now here's the part that should make you angry. Because everything I've just told you, the protest, the punishment, the quiet exoneration, all of that would be just a remarkable historical episode if the thing Pollock was fighting against had actually stopped. It didn't. The systematic gutting of the Royal Air Force didn't stop when they locked him up, didn't stop when they exonerated him, hasn't stopped yet. And the numbers are devastating. In 1968, the RAF operated in the region of 2,000 combat and support aircraft across dozens of frontline squadrons. Fast jets, strike aircraft, interceptors, reconnaissance platforms, a genuine air force capable of fighting a war. Today, the entire fast jet fleet consists of around 137 Eurofighter Typhoons, not all of them operational at any given time, and an F-35B fleet cut to a firm order of just 48, with deliveries proceeding slowly. From 2000 to fewer than 200. That's not a reduction, that's an extinction event. The bases tell the same story. In 1968, the RAF maintained dozens of operational stations across the United Kingdom. Today, a handful. RAF Tangmere, which had connections to Pollock's career, closed in 1970. RAF Coltishall closed. Binbrook closed 1988. Lucas handed to the Army. Kinloss transferred to the Army. Lynham closed 2012. Cottesmore closed. Wittering reduced to a shadow. West Raynham itself, where Pollock landed after the most famous protest flight in British military history, closed 1994. Every one of them gone. Personnel? In 1968, RAF strength stood at well over 100,000 trained men and women. Today, it's roughly 33,000 and falling. Recruitment targets missed year after year. Retention, a quiet crisis that nobody in Whitehall wants to discuss publicly because the answers are too embarrassing. Experienced pilots leaving for airline jobs that pay 3 times the salary without asking them to maintain combat readiness on a shoestring. Defence spending as a share of GDP? In 1968, Britain spent around 5 to 6%. Today, it hovers near 2.3%, and government ministers hold press conferences to congratulate themselves for barely scraping past NATO's 2% minimum, a target originally set as a floor, not a ceiling, and which most serious defence analysts consider wholly inadequate for a nation with Britain's commitments and threat environment. And the cancellations kept coming. Always the cancellations. Same pattern, same excuses, same results. The Nimrod MRA-4 maritime patrol aircraft, approximately £3.8 billion already spent developing it, cancelled outright in the 2010 Strategic Defence and Security Review. And the aircraft physically cut apart for scrap, literally taken to pieces with cutting equipment. Just like the TSR-2 airframes 45 years earlier. The same gesture, the same spiteful finality, as if the politicians couldn't bear the thought of the evidence surviving. The Harrier fleet retired early that same year, the aircraft sold to the United States Marine Corps for parts. Britain's only carrier-capable fast jet, a machine born from British innovation, gone at the stroke of a pen before its replacement was anywhere near ready to fly. The F-35 programme, Britain originally committed to purchasing 138 aircraft. The actual number delivered keeps shrinking with every spending review, every Treasury intervention, every quiet downward revision that gets announced on a Friday afternoon when nobody's paying attention. Every single thing Alan Pollock warned about has come true. Every cut he raged against was followed by another cut, and another, and another. A downward spiral that has been continuous and accelerating for more than 56 years, with no sign of reversal. The RAF he tried to save with that flight through Tower Bridge has been reduced to a fraction of what it was when he strapped into that Hunter on a Friday morning in Norfolk and decided that enough was enough. They called him mad. They locked him in a psychiatric ward for saying the government was destroying the Royal Air Force. And then the government spent the next half-century destroying the Royal Air Force, exactly as he said they would. Year after year, cut after cut, cancellation after cancellation. Precisely the trajectory he drew in the sky over London that April morning, a downward line with no bottom. Alan Pollock wasn't a reckless pilot. He wasn't mentally unfit. He was the sanest man in the room, and they punished him for it because his sanity was inconvenient. Britain could use more men like him. Subscribe for more stories like this.